This is my guitar pick cutting board. Now the funny thing is I don't even play the guitar, I'm actually a drummer, but I needed this shape. I wanted something that was roughly triangular, and I really didn't want straight edges and really sharp corners. So a guitar pick was the perfect shape. In fact, I took a picture of a guitar pick, blew it up, and then made a template out of it, and that got me the shape that I wanted. So it just happens to look like a guitar pick. If we relieve material on the bottom and leave only 3 feet, that leaves 3 points of contact with the countertop, so no matter what happens with this board, if it decides to warp, cup, bow, it's always going to sit nice and stable on the countertop, and that was the goal. All right, so here's how I made it.
Since these cutting boards are going to be gifts, I threw some really nice lumber at it, walnut and curly maple. I really want the grain to be as straight as possible, so we carefully lay out the parts on the straightest grain. The size of the strips really doesn't matter much as long as the final dimensions are about 16 inches long and 15 inches wide. The end grain is oriented vertically, which makes the board more stable and puts a more consistent quarter sawn face facing up. Each strip is then jointed and planed, cleaning up all 4 faces. That curly maple really chips out a lot, even with a helical cutter head, so the drum sander gives me a nice smooth surface. The strips are then glued together using Titebond 3, which is waterproof and food safe. This glue up is pretty straightforward, but using a set of cawls on each end will go a long way toward making sure the panel stays flat and doesn't require a lot of post-processing. If you make a lot of cutting boards, this is crucial since you could burn a lot of time and sandpaper flattening these things out.
Now I'm sure a few of you are wondering, does Mark even know about end grain cutting boards? And I certainly do. I actually have one. This is the board that I made in 2006. In fact, I think this build might be the first cutting board video to be posted to YouTube, which is kind of nuts.
Let's get ready to make a cutting board!
But this has served us well for a very long time, but it does suffer from some problems. I've got some cracks here and there. I've got some areas where the glue joints are just now starting to separate. End grain can be beautiful, but it's very challenging to build, and it's even more challenging to build correctly so that it lasts a long time. And even then, just because it's all end grain, that means it's a very thirsty surface. So problems can happen as it absorbs a lot of water. So it has its advantages and its disadvantages, but when you're really looking to batch out a bunch of boards, especially for gifts, there's nothing wrong with a good quality long grain cutting board, and that's why I went with that for this design.
After the glue is dry, I sand the surface and then give the boards a pass through the drum sander. Now I can bring over my sweet guitar pick template and trace out the shape. In some cases, I ended up with a larger blank, so I'll use a compass to make the board just a little bit bigger, utilizing more of the material. The shape is then cut out at the bandsaw. The edges are cleaned at the disc sander. I'd like there to be a substantial underside chamfer all the way around. It gives the board a lighter look. So I'm going to take several passes using a chamfering bit and sneak up on it. The top receives a smaller, simple chamfer. At this point, I'm kind of noodling a bit. I know I want to make 3 feet on the bottom, so I make a little routing template that mimics the corner shape, and then I can clamp it to the corner and use a guide bushing and a bullnose bit to establish the shape of the foot. To remove the rest of the stock, I'll make a shop-made routing jig. Basically, it's just a small version of one of those slab flattening jigs. I'll make a sturdy cradle that holds the router, and now the cutting board is attached to the workbench with double-stick tape. 2 rails are then stuck to the bench, and the cradle spans the gap. I'm going to use a bowl bottom bit since it produces a flat surface and removes a good amount of stock at once. The router is attached to the cradle, and I'm off to Sawdust Town. The real trick with this setup is being able to see what the heck you're doing. I found it best to simply hog away as much stock as possible in the safe zone in the middle, and then using a flashlight and kneeling down, I carefully sneak up on the feet. Now doing 1 wasn't so bad, but I had like 7 to do. Now I can sand the surface smooth. I sand the boards up to 220. Before applying finish, I'll raise the grain of the wood using some water. This is a very important process for a piece that'll get wet. The water will swell the fibers and make the surface really rough. Once dry, I can lightly sand the surface with 320 grit to make it smooth again. Thankfully, this phenomenon only occurs once, so this grain raising process prevents the new owner of the cutting board from having an unpleasant surprise the first time they use it. And now it's time for the oil. I like to use a food-safe drying oil, such as this polymerized linseed oil from Tried and True. I know lots of people like mineral oil, but it's just not my thing. An oil that actually dries is much more appealing and makes the most sense to me. Each coat is applied very thin, and you can warm this stuff up to make it a little bit easier to drive into the grain if you need to. All of the excess is rubbed off, and the board is left to dry overnight. The more coats of oil you apply, the better the protection, but at some point, you kinda need to pinch it off. After about 7 coats over the course of 7 days, I'll add the final coat. Now this time, I'll melt a little bit of beeswax into the oil. This oil wax mixture is then applied using a white abrasive pad, and the excess is buffed off. Now this is the point where most people would show themselves cutting a fresh bell pepper or a tomato, or something that lets the internet know how super healthy they are. But not me. I'm gonna cut up a hot dog in super sensual slow motion.
Now, if you decide to give these away as gifts or maybe you sell them, a couple recommendations for you. First of all, take a little bit of the finish with the wax in it, put it in a little jelly jar, and give that as part of the package. Give them some of the material to reapply, and then put a little card in there, like a little gift card or postcard, that explains how to care for the cutting board, when to apply the wax, what to do, and most importantly, what not to do with a wood cutting board. And that will go a long way in making sure the recipient of this cutting board is going to be happy with it for a long, long time. All right, thanks for watching, everybody. Take care.